The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound in Afghanistan's Helmand province. Sarah Martinez had been working as a humanitarian aid coordinator for 18 months, helping rebuild schools and distribute medical supplies to remote villages. At 28, she was one of the youngest coordinators in the region, driven by an unshakable belief that education could transform lives even in the most dangerous corners of the world. The village of Karga had become her second home. Children would run to greet her white SUV every Tuesday morning, their faces lighting up when they saw the boxes of school supplies and medical equipment she brought. Local elders had initially been suspicious of the young American woman, but her genuine care and respect for their customs had gradually won their trust. Sarah's team consisted of 3 other aid workers and 2 local translators. They had established a routine that felt almost normal, despite the constant threat of insurgent activity in the region. The compound where they worked was a converted school building, its walls painted with colorful murals that the children had created during art classes. On this particular morning, Sarah was reviewing supply lists when her radio crackled to life. Intelligence reports suggested increased militant activity in the area, and their security advisor recommended postponing the day's village visits. Sarah looked out the window at the children already gathering outside, their worn backpacks slung over their shoulders, eager for another day of learning. Against protocol, she made a decision that would change everything. The children had already missed too many school days due to security concerns. She convinced her team to proceed with a shortened day, planning to wrap up activities by noon. The local translator, Ahmad, shook his head with concern but agreed to stay. He had 2 daughters of his own who attended the makeshift school. The morning proceeded peacefully. Sarah helped distribute new textbooks while her colleague Emma set up a mobile medical clinic in the courtyard. The sound of children's laughter filled the air as they practiced reading aloud in both Dari and English. For a few precious hours, the war seemed like a distant memory. It was Ahmad who first noticed the unusual silence. The normal sounds of village life had stopped. No motorcycles puttering down the dusty road, no vendors calling out their wares, no elderly men gathered under the ancient mulberry tree discussing local affairs. Even the children seemed to sense the change, their voices gradually becoming quieter. Sarah was teaching a group of girls basic computer skills on donated tablets when the first explosion shattered the morning calm. The building shook violently and plaster rained down from the ceiling. She instinctively threw herself over the children, shielding them with her body as the windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and debris. The attack had begun. Chaos erupted as insurgents surrounded the compound from 3 sides. Sarah's training kicked in as she herded the children toward the reinforced safe room they had hoped never to use. Her hands were already bleeding from glass cuts, but adrenaline masked the pain. Emma was helping evacuate the medical clinic when the second explosion threw her against a concrete wall. The attackers had clearly planned this assault carefully. They knew the layout of the compound, the daily routines, and exactly when the aid workers would be most vulnerable. Rocket-propelled grenades punched holes through the outer walls while automatic weapons fire raked across the courtyard where children had been playing just minutes before. Ahmad grabbed his radio and began frantically calling for help, switching between English and Dari as he tried to coordinate with both the aid organization's security team and local Afghan forces. His voice remained steady despite the terror in his eyes as he watched his own daughters cower behind overturned desks. Sarah managed to get most of the children into the safe room, but 3 boys were trapped in the computer lab when part of the roof collapsed. She could hear them crying for help beneath the rubble. Without hesitation, she grabbed a crowbar and began digging through the concrete and twisted metal, ignoring the ongoing gunfire outside. The building structure was failing rapidly under the assault. Each explosion weakened the walls further, sending more debris cascading down. Sarah's white aid worker shirt was now torn and stained with blood and dust, but she continued working to free the trapped children. Her colleague Marcus had taken shrapnel to his leg, but was still helping evacuate the wounded. Through the smoke and destruction, Sarah could see insurgents moving through the compound's outer perimeter. They wore no uniforms, but their tactics were professional and coordinated. This was not a random attack by desperate fighters, but a calculated strike designed to send a message about the consequences of cooperating with international aid efforts. The local Afghan security forces were supposed to respond within 20 minutes, but the radio reports indicated they were being held up by a roadside bomb that had been detonated along their route. The attackers had anticipated every aspect of the response, turning what should have been a quick security intervention into a prolonged siege. As the afternoon wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate. The safe room was overcrowded with 43 children and 6 adults crammed into a space designed for 20 people. The air was stifling, and several of the younger children were beginning to panic. Sarah tried to keep them calm by leading them in songs and games, her voice hoarse from shouting over the explosions. The final assault came just as the sun began to set. The insurgents had apparently grown tired of the standoff and decided to end it decisively. They brought up heavy weapons and began systematically destroying what remained of the building. Sarah realized that the safe room would not protect them much longer. She made the hardest decision of her life, choosing to surrender herself in hopes of saving the children. As she stepped out of the safe room with her hands raised, a massive explosion tore through the building's main support structure. The last thing she remembered was the ceiling coming down and the terrified screams of the children behind her. 200 miles away at Bagram Airfield, Navy SEAL Team 6 was completing a routine training exercise when the emergency call came through. The initial reports were fragmented and confusing, but the core facts were clear. American aid workers were trapped in a collapsed building under hostile fire, with an unknown number of civilian casualties. Lieutenant Commander Jake Reaper Morrison had led dozens of rescue operations during his 12 years with the SEALs, but something about this mission felt different. The intelligence briefing revealed that the attack had been ongoing for over 6 hours, far longer than typical insurgent operations. This suggested either exceptional planning or that the attackers had a specific objective beyond simple destruction. The SEAL team's helicopter pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Maria Santos, had flown rescue missions in some of the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan. She studied the satellite imagery of the target area, while her crew prepared the modified Black Hawk for immediate departure. The compound was completely surrounded, with insurgent positions covering all approach routes. Morrison's team consisted of 8 highly trained operators, each with specialized skills crucial for this type of urban rescue operation. Hospital Corpsman Second Class David Doc Williams carried advanced medical equipment that could mean the difference between life and death for any survivors they found. Explosives expert Petty Officer First Class Tony Boom Rodriguez would handle any structural challenges they encountered. The flight to Karga took 45 minutes through contested airspace. Intelligence updates during the journey painted an increasingly grim picture. Afghan security forces had attempted 2 ground assaults, but were driven back by well-positioned machine gun nests. Attack helicopters had conducted limited strikes, but the presence of civilians in the target area severely restricted their options. As they approached the compound, Santos had to navigate through a complex pattern of ground fire and possible surface-to-air missiles. The insurgents had clearly prepared for air assault, with multiple firing positions targeting likely landing zones. She brought the helicopter in low and fast, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last possible moment. Morrison could see the devastation through his night vision goggles as they circled the target. The main building had partially collapsed, with rubble spilling out into the courtyard. Smoke still rose from several secondary fires, and the distinctive muzzle flashes of ongoing gunfire were visible from at least 6 different positions around the perimeter. The insertion point had to be precise. Too close to the building, and they would be exposed to concentrated fire from multiple directions. Too far away, and they would have to fight through heavily defended positions to reach any potential survivors. Santos identified a narrow landing zone behind a low wall that would provide temporary cover. The team fast-roped from the helicopter under covering fire from the door gunners. Morrison hit the ground first, immediately establishing a defensive perimeter while his teammates descended. The sound of gunfire was constant, with rounds snapping overhead and impacting the concrete walls around them. Within seconds of landing, they were engaged in intense combat with insurgent fighters who had positioned themselves throughout the compound. Morrison's team moved with practiced precision, each man knowing his role and trusting his teammates completely. They advanced through the rubble-strewn courtyard in coordinated bounds, using smoke grenades and suppressive fire to mask their movement. Doc Williams was the first to spot signs of life beneath the collapsed section of the main building. A small gap in the debris revealed part of what had been the safe room, and he could hear faint voices calling for help in multiple languages. The children were still alive, but time was running out as structural damage continued to worsen. The rescue operation had begun, but the SEALs quickly realized they were facing a much more complex situation than their initial briefing had suggested. Morrison split his team into 3 elements to address the multiple challenges they faced simultaneously. 4 SEALs would establish and maintain a defensive perimeter to keep the insurgents at bay, while 2 others would work on clearing debris to reach the trapped survivors. Morrison and Doc Williams would conduct immediate medical assessment and evacuation of any casualties they found. The defensive battle was fierce and unrelenting. Petty Officer Rodriguez used carefully placed charges to collapse strategic walls, creating better defensive positions while also clearing access routes to the trapped civilians. His explosives work had to be precise, powerful enough to neutralize threats but controlled enough to avoid further structural damage that could crush the survivors below. The insurgents fought with desperate intensity, apparently determined to prevent any successful rescue operation. They had stockpiled ammunition and supplies for an extended battle, suggesting this attack was part of a larger strategic plan, rather than an opportunistic strike. Their positions were well coordinated, with overlapping fields of fire that made any movement extremely dangerous. Doc Williams worked methodically through the rubble, following the sounds of voices to locate the safe room's exact position. The debris was unstable, with large concrete slabs balanced precariously on twisted steel beams. Each piece he moved could potentially trigger a larger collapse, but leaving the survivors trapped meant certain death as oxygen levels continued to drop. When he finally cleared a hole large enough to see inside, Williams was amazed by what he found. Ahmad, the local translator, had organized the children into small groups and was leading them in quiet songs to keep them calm and preserve oxygen. Several of the older children were helping tend to injuries among the younger ones, following basic first aid procedures they had apparently learned during previous emergencies. But the most remarkable discovery was Sarah Martinez. Williams initially thought she was dead, her body partially buried under a fallen beam near the safe room entrance. Her clothes were soaked with blood and concrete dust covered her from head to toe. When he checked for vital signs, however, he found a weak but steady pulse. She had apparently used her own body to shield the safe room entrance when the ceiling collapsed. The medical assessment revealed severe trauma. Sarah had suffered multiple broken ribs, a likely concussion, and significant blood loss from various cuts and puncture wounds. Most critically, a piece of rebar had penetrated her left shoulder, coming dangerously close to major blood vessels. Moving her without proper medical equipment could prove fatal, but leaving her in place was not an option. Williams immediately established an IV line and began administering emergency medication to stabilize her condition. He had to work by feel in the cramped space, using his headlamp to illuminate the work area while gunfire continued to rage overhead. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling instructions about caring for the children. Morrison coordinated the complex extraction process while maintaining communication with helicopter support and ground commanders. The insurgents had brought up heavier weapons and were making coordinated assaults on the SEAL positions. Several team members had taken minor wounds, but they continued fighting with typical SEAL determination. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez managed to clear a wider access route to the safe room. Working together, the team began evacuating the children in small groups, passing them through the rubble tunnel to waiting SEALs who immediately moved them to secure positions, away from the ongoing battle. Each child's extraction was a delicate operation requiring careful coordination between the medical team, the demolition specialists, and the defensive fighters. The insurgents seemed to recognize that the rescue was succeeding and intensified their attacks, bringing up rocket-propelled grenades and attempting to storm the SEAL positions. Ahmad emerged with the last group of children, his own injuries evident, but his focus entirely on ensuring every child was accounted for. He provided Morrison with crucial intelligence about the compound layout and insurgent positions, information that proved vital for planning the final phase of the evacuation. Sarah's extraction presented the greatest challenge. Her condition had stabilized somewhat under Doc Williams's care, but moving her through the narrow debris tunnel required extreme precision. Any jarring motion could dislodge the rebar in her shoulder, or trigger internal bleeding that would be impossible to control in field conditions. The evacuation of Sarah required the entire team's coordinated effort. Doc Williams had immobilized her as much as possible using emergency medical equipment, but the piece of rebar in her shoulder made conventional stretcher transport impossible. Rodriguez carefully removed additional debris to widen the extraction route, while Morrison directed suppressive fire to keep insurgent fighters at bay. Working in the confined space beneath tons of unstable rubble, the SEALs passed Sarah through the tunnel using a specially adapted rescue harness. Williams monitored her vital signs continuously, ready to intervene if her condition deteriorated during the movement. Each foot of progress required careful coordination between multiple team members working in near-total darkness. The insurgents recognized that their opportunity was slipping away and launched their most desperate assault yet. They brought up everything they had, including mortars and heavy machine guns, in an attempt to prevent the final evacuation. The SEAL defensive perimeter held, but ammunition was running low and several team members were showing signs of fatigue after hours of intense combat. Chief Santos had been orbiting the area in the Black Hawk, providing aerial reconnaissance and coordinating with incoming support aircraft. She identified the optimal extraction point and began her approach despite heavy ground fire. Her door gunners laid down suppressive fire while she maneuvered the helicopter into position, demonstrating the exceptional flying skills that had made her one of the most respected pilots in special operations. When Sarah finally emerged from the rubble tunnel, her condition was critical but stable. Doc Williams had managed to prevent shock and control bleeding, but she needed immediate surgical intervention that was only available at a major medical facility. Her face was barely recognizable beneath the blood and concrete dust, but her eyes occasionally fluttered open with signs of consciousness. Morrison made the tactical decision to extract in 2 phases. The children and most seriously wounded would go out first with half the SEAL team providing security. The remaining SEALs would hold the perimeter until a second helicopter could arrive for the final extraction. This plan required them to maintain their defensive positions for at least another 20 minutes under increasingly heavy attack. The first extraction proceeded smoothly, despite intense enemy fire. Santos brought the Black Hawk in low and fast, her crew chiefs rapidly loading the children and wounded civilians, while the SEALs provided covering fire. Ahmad refused to leave until all the children were safely aboard, personally counting each one as they climbed into the helicopter. Sarah was loaded last, with Doc Williams accompanying her to provide continued medical care during the flight to Bagram Airfield. As the helicopter lifted off, she briefly regained consciousness and tried to speak. Williams leaned close to hear her whispered words about making sure all the children were safe and accounted for. The remaining SEALs faced a fierce final assault as the insurgents realized their last chance to inflict casualties was disappearing. Morrison's reduced team fought with characteristic professionalism, using their remaining ammunition and explosives to maximum effect. Rodriguez set up a series of timed charges that would deny the compound to enemy forces after their departure. The second helicopter arrival was perfectly timed, with attack helicopter escorts providing close air support to suppress enemy positions. The final extraction took less than 3 minutes, with the SEALs fast roping up to the hovering aircraft while Rodriguez's charges demolished key structures behind them. As they flew away from Karga, Morrison could see secondary explosions continuing to rock the compound. Intelligence later revealed that the insurgents had stockpiled a significant amount of ammunition and explosives in the facility, confirming that this had been a major enemy operation rather than a spontaneous attack. The flight back to Bagram was tense as Doc Williams continued working to stabilize Sarah's condition. Her blood pressure remained dangerously low despite IV fluids and medication, and he was concerned about possible internal injuries that would require immediate surgery. The children, though traumatized, were physically unharmed thanks to Sarah's protection and Ahmad's leadership during the crisis. Upon landing at Bagram, Sarah was immediately transferred to the base's trauma center, where a surgical team was standing by. The children were taken to a secure area where child psychologists and interpreters began the process of assessment and family reunification. Ahmad, despite his own injuries, insisted on staying with them until their parents could be located and contacted. The surgery at Bagram Airfield lasted 4 hours as military doctors worked to save Sarah's life. The rebar had missed her major arteries by mere millimeters, but had caused significant muscle and nerve damage in her left shoulder. Her ribs were set and her various lacerations cleaned and stitched, while blood transfusions addressed the severe loss she had suffered during the attack and rescue. Lieutenant Commander Morrison visited the medical center during Sarah's recovery, bringing updates on the children who had been successfully reunited with their families. All 43 children had survived the ordeal physically unharmed, though several would require counseling to deal with the psychological trauma. Ahmad had also recovered from his injuries and was already making plans to rebuild the school in a safer location. When Sarah finally regained full consciousness 3 days later, her first questions were about the children's welfare. The nurses had to repeatedly assure her that everyone had survived before she would focus on her own recovery. The doctors explained that while she would make a full recovery, her left shoulder would have limited mobility and chronic pain that might require additional surgeries. The investigation into the attack revealed a complex plot by insurgent forces to target international aid operations throughout the region. The assault on Karga had been carefully planned as a demonstration of their capability to strike at will against civilian targets. Intelligence gathered from the compound indicated that similar attacks had been planned for other aid facilities. Sarah's actions during the crisis had undoubtedly saved lives, but she struggled with guilt over the decision to proceed with the school day despite security warnings. Morrison, during one of his visits, helped her understand that her choice to prioritize the children's education had been made with good intentions, and that the attackers bore sole responsibility for the violence that followed. The SEAL team received commendations for their successful rescue operation, but Morrison was most proud of the fact that they had brought everyone home alive. In special operations, success was measured not just by mission completion, but by the preservation of innocent life. The Karga rescue became a textbook example of how proper training, teamwork, and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. 6 months later, Sarah returned to the United States for additional medical treatment and rehabilitation. The physical therapy was painful and progress was slow, but she remained determined to return to humanitarian work. The children from Karga sent her drawings and letters through Ahmad, who had become the coordinator for the rebuilt school in a more secure location. Ahmad's new school incorporated many of the security lessons learned from the Karga attack. The building was designed with multiple safe rooms and evacuation routes, while a dedicated security team provided protection during operating hours. International support for the project had actually increased following news coverage of the attack and rescue, with donors inspired by Sarah's dedication and the children's resilience. Morrison continued his career with the SEALs, participating in numerous other operations throughout Afghanistan and other combat zones. He kept a photo from the Karga rescue on his desk, showing all 43 children safely aboard the evacuation helicopter. The image served as a reminder of why he had chosen this dangerous profession and the difference that special operations forces could make in impossible situations. 2 years after the attack, Sarah returned to Afghanistan as a regional coordinator for educational initiatives. Her left shoulder bore permanent scars, and her range of motion remained limited. But her commitment to helping children in conflict zones had only grown stronger. She worked closely with Ahmad to develop improved security protocols for schools throughout the region. The children from Karga, now older and attending the rebuilt school, still remembered the day when their teacher had protected them with her own body. Many of them spoke of wanting to become teachers themselves, inspired by Sarah's example of selfless dedication. Their resilience and determination to continue learning despite the trauma they had experienced became a symbol of hope in a region torn by decades of conflict. The story of the Karga rescue spread throughout military and humanitarian communities, serving as an example of how courage, training, and teamwork could triumph over terror and violence. Sarah Martinez's name became synonymous with the dedication of aid workers who risk their lives to bring education and hope to the world's most dangerous places, while SEAL Team 6's flawless execution of the rescue operation added another chapter to their legendary reputation for achieving the impossible.